All right, here we have a game that depicts the situation regarding negotiating measures to address the global climate change issue. And because global climate change seems directly related to the aggregate emissions in the world of carbon, gases containing carbon, greenhouse gases, it's an international problem, and there's been attempts at international solutions. Here we just have the U.S. and China as a two-country game, and in reality, it's a many-country game. But let's just consider the simplified version. So, the first question asks us to show that in the prisoner's dilemma, both countries have a dominant strategy, and then there's a dominant strategy equilibrium. So, I'm trying to write, and instead I'm moving things around. Anyway, let's just focus on this prisoner's dilemma version of the game. Notice that for the U.S., let's say the U.S. expects China to restrict. Then, given that the U.S. expects China to restrict, the U.S. could get a good outcome by restricting, but it could get the best outcome by pursuing business as usual. So if China is restricting, then business as usual is the best play that the U.S. can make. And finally, if China's following a business as usual strategy, the U.S. could restrict and get its worst payoff, or do business as usual and get its second worst, better than the worst. And so again, the U.S. has a strategy. The best strategy of the U.S. is business as usual. So the U.S. has a dominant strategy, business as usual. It's a symmetric game. I'll leave you to go through the case. What will China do if the U.S. restricts? What will China do if the U.S. conducts a business as usual set of regulations or lack of regulations? Again, you will see that China has a dominant strategy. So the dominant strategy equilibrium is where they both conduct business as usual. And that's bad, especially bad, because there's this better outcome that's potentially achievable where they both restrict. And then part B asks us, why might it be tough to negotiate a binding treaty to restrict emissions? And a binding treaty is tough in an international context because there is no effective international police. So if the U.S. or China broke the agreement, they both have nuclear power, nuclear warheads. They both are pretty big, powerful countries. It would, either one would do a lot of harm to itself as well as to the other one if they started a war. So it's not really it's not enforceable by means of military aggression either. One would hope anyway. At least if one's like I am, that nuclear warheads flying around the globe would be a really, really bad thing, no matter who's launching them. Anyway, so it's tough internationally to get an enforcing agent. So then the problem asks us to suppose that people in the U.S. care about people in China. People in China care about people in the U.S. And internationally, these countries care about their own reputation enough to want to be perceived as honorable. And so if the other country is restricting, you'd want to restrict because that's the right thing to do, and you care about how you're viewed as a global leader. Anyway, so this would be if countries were inequality averse and motivated by reciprocity. So let's think about, they want us to show there's two Nash equilibria. There are no dominant strategies. I'll leave you to verify that. But let's just look at various outcomes and test for Nash equilibria. So let's see where U.S. is conducting business as usual. China is restricting. So given that China is restricting, would the U.S. want to change? Well, they could keep doing business as usual, or they could restrict. And notice that the U.S. would improve its payoff from good to best. So we can conclude, because given what the other party is doing, one party has an incentive to switch. Turns out China has an incentive to switch too, but all you need is one party has an incentive to switch. It's not a Nash equilibrium. So we've ruled that one out. Let's try the case where China is following business as usual and the U.S., for some reason, my square didn't look like a square. Anyway, if given that China's conducting business as usual, the U.S. could restrict and get its worst outcome, or it could conduct a business as usual strategy and get just a bad outcome. So the U.S. would have an incentive to switch. And notice that so too with China. If the U.S. is restricting, China could restrict and move from good to best. So anyway, this one's out too. That leaves us two. Let's just verify that they're Nash equilibria. So here, let's consider this one. If they're both restricting, given that China's restricting, would the U.S. have an incentive to conduct business as usual? No. Given that the U.S. is restricting, would China have an incentive to conduct business as usual? No. So this one is a Nash equilibrium. And then, so too, though, is the both conducting business as usual. If China is conducting business as usual, will the U.S. want to switch to restrict? No. And likewise, if the U.S. is conducting a business as usual, would China want to restrict? No. They'd move from bad to worse. So again, the both conduct business as usual is an alternative equilibrium. And then we're asked, would it be easier to negotiate a treaty in this case? And in this case, yes, it would. And the reason is that if we negotiated a treaty and got us to this one Nash equilibrium where both restrict, unlike the case where there's this dominant strategy to do business as usual over in the prisoner's dilemma versus the game, here, because of the nature of these reciprocal preferences, the preference for fairness, if we can get to restrict, there is no incentive on the part of either country to change their activity. So if you could get us there, get the system there, then an agreement would be much more likely to hold. You don't need a police agency. It's in both of the countries' best interest to keep abiding by the agreement. So that's what C looks like. And then finally, describe the changes in preferences or in some other aspect of the problem that would convert the game to one in which, like the invisible hand game, both countries choosing restrict as a dominant strategy equilibrium. Here, if climate change turns out to be this catastrophic event, this actually literally an existential threat to all nations' well-being, it seems like sometimes individual countries, individual citizens within countries, but also countries at large and the international system sometimes needs just some sort of catastrophe to make it really obvious that this climate change is a big deal. And in the face of catastrophe, peoples can muster the political will to say restrict carbon emissions, to do very take extreme measures to fix some urgent problem. So that's one thing about climate change that is so troublesome in getting a solution now. The worst effects are still decades off, unless you're Nauru or some country that has a highest point of 5 feet above sea level. Unless you're one of those countries, it's like, there's a little more erosion on the beach, but nobody's dying and we're not losing thousands and thousands of acres to the sea. The disaster might not be happening for 20, 50, however many years out. The problem, of course, is that carbon stays in the atmosphere. We don't know right now, anyway, how to get it out of the atmosphere quickly. And even if we wait for catastrophe, it might be another 30 years after we take measures to limit carbon before the atmosphere actually starts featuring less carbon in it. So this is a pretty difficult problem to address internationally. And it's an international problem because it doesn't matter whether we burn a ton of coal in the U.S. or in China. The damage to the atmosphere is the same. So it's got to be an international agreement, and it's tough to get countries to agree in the first place, let alone live up to those agreements.